UNICEF tracks the numbers, and here they are. 44% of all fatalities among children under 5 can be attributed to neonatal deaths. Our next two guests are trying to change that. Dr. Kate Rogers is a UNICEF Senior Program Manager and coordinator of the New York-based Committing to Child Survival, a Promise Renewed. This global campaign is working to end preventable maternal, newborn, and child mortality. It's supported by the World Health Organization, the United States government, and hundreds of governments and NGOs around the globe. Also joining us via satellite from Boston, Massachusetts is Tim Prestero. He's the CEO and founder of Design That Matters. It's a company that creates easy-to-use, accessible, and affordable medical devices for underdeveloped communities. Their Firefly device is currently being used to get much-needed phototherapy to jaundiced babies in developing countries. Take a look at what they do.
Jaundice affects 2/3 of newborns around the world. 10% of those cases require some kind of treatment. If they don't receive therapy, it can lead to lifelong brain damage or even death. The solution is shine blue light on as much of the baby's surface as possible. Why is that hard? We know how to generate bright light. The issue is, how do you do it in the context of the developing world?
Kate, Tim, welcome to the broadcast. Kate, I'm going to get to you in just a second, but I want to start with you, Tim, because there's this saying here in the United States, you hear it all the time, failure is not an option. And yet the Chinese idiom is failure is the mother of success. And I think you would probably agree more with the Chinese idiom. Tell us about your story and how you got to Firefly.
Sure, yeah. The Chinese idiom is definitely more our experience. We started working in newborn health 5 or 6 years ago. Our first project was an incubator, a newborn incubator. So of the 2 million newborn deaths around the world every year, about half of those kids would make it if you could just keep them warm for the first day or the first week. So our bright idea was to build an incubator. I went to MIT. I mean, how hard is it to make a box that keeps a baby warm? It turns out that that's not the hard thing. Making the box isn't the hard thing, but actually manufacturing the box, distributing the box, teaching people how to use the box, following up and seeing that they're using it appropriately. So our first project, this incubator, NeoNurture, wasn't successful. We weren't able to connect with manufacturing partners, and I think that having learned from that experience, which was frustrating and disappointing, that led to Firefly. So basically turning it around and figuring out, well, how do we start at the finish line? How do we start by talking to the people who will use it, manufacture it, everything else, such that the decisions that we make are much more likely to lead to success.
We'll talk a little bit more about Firefly in just a moment, but Kate,
Sure.
Getting to that finish line, vitally important, because I think some of our viewers may not understand the severity or consequences of these early births. Can you talk to us about what you see on a daily basis? I mean, what are the numbers? What's the landscape? What does it look like out there?
I think in terms of newborn deaths, we're seeing that they now, as you said, count for 44% of all under 5 deaths. And so many of these deaths can be prevented with simple, available solutions. And it's a matter of figuring out, how do we distribute them? How do we get them out there to the kids who need them most?
How frustrating is it out there? Because, you know, he's saying shouldn't be that tough, and yet it is tough. It's been difficult.
No, and it's been a process of working with governments to build up their health systems so that they have the distribution networks, so that they have the procurement facilities, so that they have quality of care in the centers where, you know, they're really beyond the capitals, they're out in the periphery. So it's an ongoing process.
Tim, let me talk a little bit more about Firefly, because one of the things I really like about what you're doing, and I've seen you speak about this, is that the old incubators, they might go to a hospital in dire need, and suddenly you'd have 3 babies under there, and you've created one where it's just 1 baby, that's all you can fit in there.
The biggest difference between design and engineering, as I've learned, is that in design, as opposed to engineering, there's no such thing as a dumb user. What that means is that there are only dumb products. So if we go overseas to a hospital and we see that people are using a device incorrectly, you can't lay it on them. Oh, you should have read the manual. Typically, the manual is not even a language that they speak, you know, an English language manual, say in India where they speak Hindi. So I think that as designers, we've thought about, well, how do we make the right way to use a device, even a relatively simple device. How do we make the right way to use it the easiest way to use it? Or turn around, like, how do you make a device that's hard to use incorrectly? And I think that with Firefly, phototherapy is not a complicated technology, but it's easy to use phototherapy incorrectly, putting too many kids under the same light, or adjusting the light so that it's not as effective. So Firefly is really designed to be hard to use wrong. The right way to use it is the easiest way to use it.
Let me ask you about Promise Renewed. For viewers who might not be familiar with it, how would you describe it?
So in 2012, the governments of the US, India, and Ethiopia decided collectively to convene what we call the global child survival community. And they did so with the intent to really reinvigorate the agenda around child survival. A lot of progress, as we know, has been made over the past 20 years in terms of accelerating the decline in preventable child deaths. But what they wanted to do was really shine a light on the public policy agenda and elevate it as an issue that countries really get around. And they succeeded in mobilizing an unprecedented coalition around this issue, and that in turn resulted in 178 governments signing a pledge to accelerate declines in preventable deaths. And what that means is getting these very simple, low-cost solutions out to the kids who need them most to save more women, more children from preventable deaths. And we've seen over 24 countries now sharpening their national strategies around maternal, newborn, and child deaths, and setting costed targets, and really taking steps to make sure that these solutions get to the kids who need them.
The one word that jumped out at me was, you said reinvigorate. Is it tough to, because that indicates that there's an effort underway, but there needs to be more, gin it up some. Is it just that there's so much out there on the landscape that people are tackling from health issues in some of these countries that perhaps the attention that should be devoted to this isn't? No,
you're absolutely right. I mean, the poorest countries tend to be inundated with global initiatives, and the consequence of that is that you have a lot of verticalized programs that tend to dilute the focus that ministries of health, for example, can place on any one initiative. And so what we're trying to do is say, look, it's great that you have all of these different strategies, but we have to make sure that they're aligned with a very specific end goal. And in this case, the end goal is just keeping kids alive.
Speaking of goals, the Millennium Development Goals, will they be achieved, do you think?
I think we've seen tremendous progress in some countries. I think the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs, as we refer to them, they've been hugely successful in terms of generating additional momentum around particular issues like maternal, newborn, child survival. I think we're going to see that we have an unfinished agenda in certain countries where there's still more that can be done, but we have seen huge progress in countries like Ethiopia, for example, where they have met MDG 4, which is the target for child survival, despite the fact that we all know that they're operating in a resource-constrained environment.
Mm-hmm. Tim, she mentioned reinvigorate. You're a guy who went to MIT. You could have done just about anything, I suspect, after leaving there. What drew you to this line of work?
Well, I was a Peace Corps volunteer before I went to MIT, and the experience was rewarding but frustrating because I didn't know where to start. Talking about poor countries that have so many items on the agenda, I was in Ivory Coast in West Africa, and it was very difficult to figure out what sort of corner of the problem to work on. So 2 million newborn deaths sounds like an enormous problem. It's not a problem statement, though. A problem statement meaning a well-defined need that we can tackle. Once we started getting into some of these health issues like jaundice and the issues of being low birth weight or prematurity, and understanding that, what you need is a box that you can keep warm for 24 hours a week. It's like, well, okay, 2 million newborn deaths, that sounds like an impossible problem to solve. Keep a box warm for a day? That's not a hard problem to solve.
But creating the box is only part of the issue. I mean, you've got to marry this technology with other organizations. You've got to work with them. You've got to make sure that it gets to the right people. I mean, there are a lot of hurdles you have to cross talk to me about that process, and how did you decide on the organizations that you were going to partner with?
That's a great question. So there's one of the popular terms of art is human-centered design. The idea is that we're going to put people in the center of the work that we do. One of the challenges in designing for developing countries is, who is our human? Is the human going to be the doctor who, it turns out, doesn't actually use the device, but rather tells the nurse what to do? Is it the nurse? Is it the maintenance technician? Is it the organization who certifies this device? So it turns out that human-centered design isn't really the appropriate approach, because there are so many different stakeholders, all of whom are necessary for a product to be successful. So with Firefly, there were really three groups that we had to pull together. One was manufacturing. So we're partnered with a Vietnamese manufacturer named MTTS that has made very successful newborn health technologies for years now. But as they scale outside of Vietnam, the challenge that they're having in other countries is that everybody wants affordable, nobody wants cheap. So how do we help them design products using their manufacturing processes that look attractive, but they're still affordable? So that's our manufacturing partner. In terms of distribution, there's an organization out in California called East Meets West, now called Thrive Networks, where they're providing this equipment to hospitals around the developing world. So they understand distribution. And then in terms of financing, there's a foundation up in Oregon called the Lemelson Foundation that had the vision to sort of pull all three groups together so that we could collaborate to get this done. And Firefly's in 10 countries now. We're treating thousands of kids. So you're right, it's not just about designing the box, you've got to design this whole system.
All right, Tim, thanks so much for joining us from Boston. Kate, it's been a delight talking to you as well. Really appreciate what both of you are doing. It's very important work.
Great,
Thanks,
thank
Mike.
you.
Coming up next, some expert advice on finding the fountain of youth at any age.